What's up, GoPo, and welcome to your weekly address, where today the topic is on the ratification of the Constitution and the debate between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Let's do it. All right, so to kickstart things, let's talk about the ratification of the Constitution.
Count it!
Article 7 of the Constitution outlines how the Constitution could be ratified, and ultimately the decision on how to ratify it came down to a 9 out of 13 state majority had to approve and sign off on the Constitution. And how that process worked is from the Constitutional Convention. Each state was given a written copy of the Constitution, and then each state would have a vote to determine whether or not the Constitution would be approved. This was ultimately a safeguard of a check and balance between federal and state power, something we know was a central issue in one of the compromises between the federal and state governments when the agreement was to create the new Constitution. Now, each state would ultimately vote to determine whether to approve the Constitution. That meant that now, inside each of those 13 states, there would be different issues. Every state had its own regional political issues. And so therefore, within the states, almost automatically, there became a controversy over whether or not the federal government and the Constitution were too powerful. There was an overarching fear that the Constitution provided too much power for the federal government. And those that harbored that feeling, they were known as Anti-Federalists. Anti-Federalists were people who were opposed to the Constitution having too much power. Anti-Federalists were people that preferred that the state power be supreme to the federal power. And in that regard, the Anti-Federalists were a pretty strong group. Some of the most popular and prominent Anti-Federalists were well-known revolutionary heroes like Thomas Jefferson, George Mason from nearby Virginia, Patrick Henry, who famously said, "Give me liberty or give me death." He was also Virginian. James Otis was another famous Anti-Federalist. These were big names. And these Anti-Federalists began almost immediately to attack the Constitution and say, we're not going to approve, we're not going to ratify the Constitution because it gives too much power to the federal government.
Yeah!
In response to the Anti-Federalists, of course, comes the Federalists. And these were thinkers and people who supported the power of the Constitution, who wanted the federal government to have supreme power. And the biggest names there I'll throw at you would be John Jay, future Supreme Court Chief Justice, James Madison, who of course was the architect, the main framer of the Constitution, and then third, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, Jay, Madison. The three of them concocted an idea to rally support throughout the 13 states for the Constitution's ratification. What Madison, Hamilton, and Jay decided is that they would write a series of essays. In fact, they wrote 85 essays, with Hamilton writing 51 of those 85, and Madison wrote 29 of those 85. And in those 85 essays, they ultimately tried to argue for why the Constitution should be approved. They published these under a fake name, a pseudonym, named Publius. And the name Publius goes back to old Roman Republic general that supported the Republic of Rome, and so it was like an homage to history. So all of a sudden, these Federalist papers are getting published, and they're being printed in newspapers. Think of it like today, a social media battle breaking out between Meek Mill and Drake or something like that, where they're going back and forth. Or from my era, it was Jay-Z and Nas slinging back and forth. But the point is, the Federalists print their papers, their essays. You're going to read those. We're going to really dive into those on Monday. And then the Anti-Federalists, of course, they had to publish their own papers, and they even chose other Romans like Brutus and Cato to put their pseudonyms on. So this thing starts heating up. It goes back and forth for years, actually, between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. But the point being here that one of the greatest compromises that comes out of the Anti-Federalist-Federalist debate is ultimately the Anti-Federalists claimed that because the Constitution was too all-powerful, there needed to be greater protection of personal liberties, freedoms, and that's where we get the Bill of Rights.
He's on fire!
So the Federalists agreed upon ultimately a compromise with the Anti-Federalists over the Bill of Rights. There's Solar from Global. He's going to be in the background, I suppose. So the Anti-Federalists argued for the need of a Bill of Rights. And that came about because over the fear that the Constitution was not protective enough of individual liberties. And it was a good thing the Bill of Rights was included because Madison ultimately goes back to the drawing board. the Federalists did agree that they would add a Bill of Rights, because basically the Anti-Federalists said we won't approve the Constitution without a Bill of Rights. And so the Federalists knew what was at stake. They didn't want the Constitution to fail. And so, as a result, the Federalists go ahead and they write out the Bill of Rights. Without the Bill of Rights, maybe the Constitution isn't passed, who knows? But, point being, the Anti-Federalists prevail. And so Madison writes 12 amendments, 10 of which were approved. Only 10 made it in. We're going to be going over all those this week. There's Kiana. She's making an appearance as well.
Boom, shakalaka!
So the Federalists rewrite the Constitution. A Bill of Rights is added. The Anti-Federalists get a big victory. But nonetheless, as the votes begin to trickle in from around the country, we don't just get 9 states that approve the Constitution. All 13 states eventually approve the Constitution. And all told, it took 4 years for this process. From writing the Constitution to the final state, Rhode Island, ratifying the Constitution took 4 years. By the way, Delaware was the first state. So finally, the ratification comes at the end of 1790, and by 1791, the Constitution is the official government of the United States. But not without compromise and not without a serious amount of labor to get to that point to where the Constitution had to be rewritten not once but twice to include the Bill of Rights. And so ultimately, where we leave off here on Monday is we're going to be looking at the Federalist Papers, we'll be looking at Anti-Federalist Papers, and then we'll be diving into later in the week the Bill of Rights. So as always, I'll end things as reminding you the past shapes the future. Take care, GoPo, and have a good weekend. And Tucker says goodbye too. You guys can wave too.